Okay, now we're going to turn our attention to grain grading operations best practices with a discussion featuring panelists Kia Adams, Mikesh, and Don Wray. Kia is a graduate of the University of Minnesota with a bachelor's degree in human resources and industrial relations and entrepreneurial management. She has been CEO of Adams Independent Testing in Fargo, North Dakota since 2019, and also serves as Vice President for North Dakota Grain Inspection. Don Wray has worked in the grain industry with the majority of his time in grain operations. After graduating from the University of Toledo in business operations, he moved into supervision and plant management. He ran the Anderson's port terminals and ran regional operations. He was moved into director of operations role and was the head of safety for the grain group. He now serves as the director of operations for the Andersons and leads the training and mentoring of operators for their grain and trade operations. So with that, since I was in such a hurry, I need to get my questions for y'all since I'm going to be moderating this panel discussion. So let me get those real quick. So the purpose we wanted to have this discussion here today is obviously from the grain inspectors, the officially designated agency perspective, and from the grain elevator perspective. So from the grain elevator perspective, Don, I think I just really wanted to kick this off and just talking about the your involvement, obviously how you, for your involvement working with an officially designated agency. I mean, obviously when you have to deal with Kia, with her, with her agency that's part of the Federal Grain Inspection Service, kind of get your perspective from the grain elevator.
All right, thanks, Jess. As Jess said, I've had 35 years in the industry, and quite honestly, when I was younger and dealing with an agency, the official agencies or FIGIS, sometimes the relationships I felt like they were a little fractured. We weren't always on the same team. And as I grew and as I went through my career, I realized the best results we normally would get was from a team approach. And to really have that team approach, we needed good communications. And that communications is two ways. I think there's things that the official agencies and FIGIS should sort of expect to get from the facilities, the managers, when they're coming out. And I also think from a facility standpoint, there are things that we should expect and want and receive from the official agencies and from FIGIS. And when you're doing that and everybody knows and there's good and early communications, you get that team approach, and in the end, the result, we want to get that train loaded out on time. We need to get that vessel loaded out on time. We want to be able to fulfill that contract, line grade that contract the best we can, and by working as a team, that's when you're going to be able to have those type of results.
Right. So Kia, can you give me from your perspective, obviously you work for an officially designated agency, so you're essentially part of the Federal Grain Inspection Service, correct? Your facility is, I guess you could say, is operated or part of the government. Is that correct? Or how do you want to explain that? Because I know there's a lot of those in the industry right now that may not be quite as familiar with how FGIS was created and how the designated and delegated agencies came about. So I think a little background on that would be helpful.
Yeah, so how many of you guys in here deal with an official grain inspection or FGIS? Quite a few. Okay, so over my career, I've noticed that a lot of people, you may have official grain inspections at your facility, maybe even on a daily basis, and aren't even fully sure where it came from. And so we've been having a lot of discussions around what is FGIS and what is the difference of this versus another lab. And the Federal Grain Inspection Service came about in the 70s due to essentially some fraudulent acts that were happening in the grain industry. And quite a few people, I think, went to prison, and it was a pretty big deal. And the government stepped in and decided to make a set of rules, and the act, the United States Grain Standards Act, gave more in there on how they were going to designate agencies throughout the country. when people are talking about official agencies, you're going to hear the word designated a lot. And really what that means is we have specific territories. And so our agency, we're in parts of North Dakota, Illinois, Ohio, Indiana. And why it's kind of more fractured like that is we can't just operate wherever we want. The government has very specific boundaries that we operate within, down to a singular road. And the reason for that is to ensure the most unbiased grades and grading that you can get. I've personally been involved in situations where there was 2 agencies through a program FGIS had for a while, and it does make it very difficult if, say, we call something sour, and then pressure can come in saying, well, if I go to this other agency, maybe they won't call it sour. So the FGIS has really been in place to make sure that the buyers and sellers know exactly what they're getting or what they're selling. And so you can trust that when that train comes in, that you know what those grades are. So that's really where it came from.
Okay. And I do want to let you know, if there are questions or comments from the audience, we are open to that. I'll have to run back and forth then, or not unless I can pass the microphone around. But please, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to jump in here too. So coming from that perspective, Don, so how do you explain if you are working with an officially designated agency and you have an appeal or a reinspection, how does that process work within your company, working with, say, Kia's group?
Well, obviously, you can ask for a reinspection at any time for any grade factor that you have. It normally will go to a different inspector. That is the best case scenario. So, that you can say, hey, I would like to have my FM, re-inspected. It shouldn't be, you should never fear that they are going to be upset by that. I have, in very few cases over my career, have I ever felt like an inspector was upset because I asked for a reinspection. We all know that there's 2 sides of the sample, and it's very common to have slight variations to it. At that point, you can appeal the process if you still don't agree with the reinspection, and the appeal will go to FGIS. And they will then grade that sample. And at that point, if you still want to take it further, you can go to Kansas City for a bar review, and the entire sample will be regraded at that point. So at that point, if you send it off to Kansas City, even though you were only asking for maybe BCFM to be re-inspected, the entire sample and all grade factors will be re-inspected at that point, and that is the final part of the appeal process. I will say, in my experience of sending maybe 6 or 7 times where it got to the point where we sent it to Kansas City, I'd say at least half of the time it came back in our favor. So it's not a case where, yeah, they're always going to side with what the inspection service. I feel it's a very fair process, and it's also normally a very quick process. You can have it overnighted and usually have the review by the next day.
This process is one of my favorite processes of the Federal Grain Inspection Service because I think it's what really helps everyone in this room. And knowing that you don't just have one agency that maybe they're having an off day, you have rights as being grain handlers, and this is one of them. And with all the new people coming in, new merchandisers, new grain handlers, this is something that I think is really important for everyone to know, that you have this option. And like Don said, I love it when people do this because one, it's your right. You can ask for an appeal for it to go to Kansas City for the field office to do. And I can assure you he's right. They do not play favorites in any way, shape, or form. I mean, we watch out for those grades just as much as you guys, and seeing like, hey, did we do something wrong? they are very fair with it, and we really, as agencies, we take those results and we're required to analyze them as well. And so we keep logs and review that and see maybe if our inspector's line gets a little bit where they're picking a little hard or a little less. So it's a very important process. We've also seen grain handlers use it as a quality control piece within their facility, where maybe once every, I don't know, we'll just say once a month, you pick a sample from one of your trains and just call it in for an appeal. We have seen that happen as well, and that's been really nice. Some places have really strict quality control, and that's just another way that you can guarantee that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. One thing to note too about these is, Don mentioned you can ask for, say, your FM. You want that re-inspected. Once you re-inspect that FM, you can't re-inspect anything else in that sample. So be aware of that. That's why you'll a lot of times see like vomitoxin on a separate certificate than the grade. And you can have those on the same certificate, but sometimes people will ask for them separately, because then if you find out later you needed to re-inspect vomitoxin, you can do that because it's on a separate certificate. So we do have very strict rules around it, but you can get up to the next level of the appeals.
So both of you, well, especially the grain inspectors, right, you have complete and total control over transportation, right? So you have complete and total control out of, all the rail cars that are coming in. So you know exactly, you're responsible for what time they come in, at midnight on Christmas Eve, right?
It'd be wonderful.
Yeah, exactly. So how do you all work together on that? Obviously, that's a major issue that's coming up. That's a current issue, transportation. I think, as everyone's very well aware of, especially for the rail cars, and that's a very big issue when it comes to the timing, right? So a lot of that if the grain elevator is obviously working with the officially designated agency to do stowage exams and so forth, how are you all dealing with that type of situation? Because that's very challenging for both the grain elevators, for you, and that's obviously having a large impact on as far as the employees go, right? As far as employee retention and recruiting, right?
I'll start with that because I think it really starts from the facility level. And this goes back to where I started off with that really good communications. I always look at it at a facility level. For all the facility managers or supervisors, you would never knowingly have that knowledge you have a train this week, but not tell any of your employees, and wait until 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday and then spring it on them, hey, by the way, we have a train on Saturday. And I feel like the official agency should be treated with the same respect that you treat your employees with. My best practice that I always followed, and I've always had my managers and supervisors follow, is on Monday, if you know you have loadings going on that week, if you know you have rail cars or several different unit trains going out, I always touch base with the official agencies on Monday morning, and I'd let them know this is what we're looking at. On Wednesday, looks like we're going to have 30 wheat cars that we're loading, and on Friday, we're going to have a 100-car unit train, number 2 yellow corn. And I'll follow up with you during the week if there's any changes. They realize, but it's just one of those things that you want to give them that heads up early so they can be looking at their labor and they can be talking to their teams saying, hey, look, we're going to have rail cars Friday. And they also have a lot of other facilities that they are taking care of. So they need to know that information early because there might be 3 or 4 other facilities that also have unit trains on Friday. So the best thing you can do is give them that early heads up, and then if a unit train happens to slip, which doesn't normally happen, right, and into the weekend, you give them that heads up as soon as you find out.
He hit it on the head. Communication is the biggest thing. I've seen a lot of facilities over the years saying, well, I don't want to keep texting you and bothering you. You never know when this train is going to pop up. I mean, that happens a lot of times. And so sometimes people feel like when they text us or call in or whatever it might be, that they're locking in a time. We understand just as well as you guys that you have no idea when this train's gonna get into, more than likely. And so we really love knowing the second you might know, even if just giving a heads up for, hey, this month we're thinking we're gonna have X amount of trains. Any type of communication you can give is really helpful. It used to be, I feel like when I started and when I was younger, we were really based off of a harvest season. And you knew when it was going to get busier and when it wasn't. And you could plan time off for people around that. And I'm sure you guys have the same issues. And due to all the changes in so many areas, that's not the case anymore. And so, where June used to be a really slow month for us across the board, it just randomly will spike up a bunch. So the communication of how much you're expecting is really helpful too. If you are planning on shutting down for a few weeks to do certain maintenances or anything like that, that's really helpful too. Anything that we can know in advance, we can then kind of plan around it. With grain inspections, an easy thing to happen is for our employees to burn out quickly. I'm sure none of you here deal with that, right? And so if we know in advance, we can kind of tell people, hey, take this time to rest for a little bit because it's going to be ramping up again. But text us or call us as much as you want, even if it's just an hourly update. When it gets closer to, nothing hurts.
Well, and I think getting back to the employees and the training, right? So obviously that's a challenge for everybody in here. I think everyone's having to deal with the labor issue on multiple levels, but when it comes to inspectors, right? So when you do hire somebody, I mean, how long does that take? I mean, what type of shortage do you have? And I think that's the same for Don too, at the individual facilities. How does that work?
Yeah, so for a sampler, we can usually train them rather quickly, but they do have 30-day probationary periods per the act that they need to have someone with them at all times during that training period. We do a lot of training after that. It doesn't end at 30 days, but as far as inspectors, so we'd say a lot of times the first license we'll get someone is corn. It tends to be the quickest and simplest one to learn first. And that at a minimum will take 2 to 3 months to train someone and them having them in the office most of those days. Then you add on soybeans and that's gonna be an extra 2 to 3 months. And wheat can pretty easily take 5 to 6 months to train someone. It really depends on what level of wheat license. There are a few different types where you can have things called limited wheat licenses where you don't need to go into the hard red spring and all the wheat of other classes. But up in North Dakota, we have to get the full license. We see everything up there, and that one generally takes about 6 months. And we have to send that inspector to the Kansas City field office for about a week for specialized training up there as well. So you're looking at a minimum a year to get 3 licenses.
And then what's the retention? And then after they get all that, they decide to leave?
I mean, that hurts. That hurts when they leave after all that. Usually what we will do is we'll get someone a corn license and then we're gonna wait a little while and make sure that they stick it out. And then if they've proven that, okay, they've made it through, a good 4 months of handling these trains or going out to container facilities, then okay, now we're gonna get you soybeans. And then wheat we usually reserve for people who've been there for a while because that's a really big investment to get someone trained.
It's funny, as far as inspectors go, our busiest time, during a harvest, in my opinion, is probably the time that I'm not as worried about my inspectors, only because I'm not seeing damage come in. I'm not seeing, it's not when you're being pressured to really be able to make sure that you're picking the grain the hardest. So it's the off season for us. It's 6-9 months after harvest when that corn's coming in or wheat's coming in that I think is really important to have really good inspectors monitoring what's coming across your scales. For us, our inspectors, that's more of a long-term commitment. So we usually don't do almost any training or basic training on inspectors on our early in career employees, 3 to 4 years. Once we know that an employee is really committed, that's when we'll start putting them through becoming certified inspectors. But as I think people would, outside the industry might not get that, boy, your busiest time and you're not worried about having some maybe not as tenured inspectors, monitoring what's coming across the scale. But quite honestly, when that corn's coming right out of the field, we have a good heads up, let me put it that way. If we know that there's kernel damage or if there's certain issues with the wheat, we have a heads up early enough on that, okay, we have to make sure we have the right inspectors in there. But on normal years, that's not really as big an issue for us.
Okay. Kia, from your perspective as an officially designated agency, what role does FGIS have in monitoring you?
A really big role. So we are, I think there's about 44 agencies across the nation right now. And each one of us have the same set of regulations that we have to go through and rules. We have a whole list of handbooks, directives, program directives. There's all sorts of things that we have to abide by, and they're coming out all the time. So they monitor us to make sure we're abiding by those, but really the biggest thing that we're doing is making sure that we're consistent across the board in grading across all 44 of those agencies and FGIS. So we have every single day, we upload all of our data, all of the grades into an FGIS federal system. Those grades are essentially owned by the federal government, if you will. And we have, they have a randomized program that picks some out, and they send us an email, and we have to send in those samples, or we have to have our quality assurance specialists grade them. There's a few different types. So every single day, we are sending in random samples to FGIS for them to regrade and verify. And at that point, too, they'll even take that a step further, and some of those will get, some of the local ones that our QASs are doing on our other inspectors will get flagged as what's called steps, and that goes to the bar, which Dawn was talking about a little bit earlier with the appeals. There's the FGIS field office that does more of the day-to-day monitoring. They'll do the first line of appeals, but then there's the bar, which is Board of Appeals and Review, and their job is to make sure our QASs are perfect as they can be. And so when those steps come, it is monitoring to make sure that our QAS is monitoring our people correctly. On top of those, we do things like running proteins is a pretty simple test to do. You put the grain in and hit go, basically. But with that, there's so much more to it that goes on, that we have standardized reference samples that we have to run every single day before we even touch that machine and enter it into a program to make sure that the bias isn't off. We send in weekly samples with weekly monitors with proteins. We do that with all mycotoxins, and we have annual internal audits that are reviewed by compliance officers, and compliance officers come out and monitor us on site. So for our size agency, we have every few years, we have about 4 weeks worth of all-day on-site reviews and compliance reviews where they go through every pan ticket and pretty meticulously.
I'll just add that, the FIGIS office is there to give us the support, and make sure that we are receiving the support from the official grading agencies. With the labor shortages as it is right now, we just had, I'll bring up a recent event where we had an agency that had lost some of their inspectors, and we were loading unit trains and they weren't able to give us the service. They said they could give us the service, but then what they did was just had someone collect all the samples, and they said, okay, we're going to bring it back to our office and we'll get you grades tomorrow or the next day. Well, if you're loading a unit train and you have 22 hours from the time the train was placed to release that train, we were in a bind, because here we're releasing a train that we don't even have grades for. And so we contacted the FIGIS field office, and we said, hey, we understand there's an issue here, but, we're not getting a service that we're required. And the field office actually sent someone from, it was the Toledo field office, out to our facility to grade those trains until that official agency could get restaffed back up. So they are there to give the support, to you if for some reason you're not able to get the support from your official agency.
Well, and I think that's a good segue into there's always the topic of, the exceptions, right? Non-use of service and exceptions. So what happens if, you have a facility, you're the officially designated agency where you're located is not performing services or not able to perform services? What are you as a grain elevator, what can you do about this, right? And I know that's a very big issue because it's a territorial issue, right? There's some obviously officially designated agencies, they want to protect their territory, and oftentimes they may not want another agency to come in to where you're located to do the work, right? And oftentimes FGIS has to be called to come in to help, I would say, facilitate that situation. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that can be there's a lot of ways around that. So as I noted earlier, we have these territories for a reason, and it truly is for the benefit of you guys. But like he said, every once in a while, especially with labor shortages, things changing, maybe an agency isn't up to par of what you're needing. And the first thing I will say is never be afraid to call FGIS. You could call their field offices. Generally, if you call the field office, you can have more of a conversation, and it doesn't necessarily have to be an on-the-record thing. So if you're looking of more of a, hey, what do I do in this situation? Calling a field office is a good idea. There is the compliance division too. If you're like, no, something needs to change right now, you had some issues and you want action taken, don't ever be afraid to call the compliance division either. And everything's on the FGIS website. Jess knows them all. I'm sure he could get you information too. But there are different things that can be done that us as agencies and within FGIS we can do. So we've done this. There are things that happen in life, and especially if it's a smaller agency, it might disrupt it a little bit more. And we've been called in to help with an adjacent agency where there was some big shifts, and we were able to do what's called a service agreement, and where we sign off, the agency recognized some things happened and they needed help, and we came in and did it as long as they needed. And we're providing the same service, so we're under the same monitoring, the same guidance, the same rules and regulations. So it might be a little different because you're talking to a different person or a different manager, or you're seeing different inspectors out there, but ultimately you're getting the same service. So it's not a big deal if another agency has to come in and help that. A service agreement though, all parties have to agree to it, including that incumbent agency, that it's their territory. Now say that they don't want to, because we are technically only obligated to give a sampler on site per the regulations. Those, I would say, were written in a time that on-site grades were not a thing. So I'm sure a lot of you in here would be pretty upset if you couldn't get on-site grades. That's a really big deal for your day-to-day operations. So if there are things that are service issues like that, then, and it's more than a one-off thing, definitely communicate with FGIS, and they can help facilitate that and make sure you're getting the service that you need. Because ultimately, the goal of FGIS is to facilitate the marketing of grain and commodities. And if we're doing something that's hurting that, then we want to know. And these rules and regulations were put forth by the industry, standards. And so if there's anything that is outdated, and they hear about that, they can really work to do that, which right now they are currently doing on the exceptions and non-use. They're coming up with a more updated version on what to do from that, from a lot of feedback that they've gotten from industry, and I'm really excited to see what they come out with.
I agree with what Kia said. I would say the one fact, though, is if you have an agency that says, no, we don't want this, another agency coming in, it can get clunky. And I'm trying to put it nicely. It can get clunky. You can go through compliance, but it's for facility operators, you know, that when we need something, we need it done today, it can be a little frustrating, but there are avenues to take.
And I think that kind of gets to the topic that we were talking about earlier too, and I think part of the concern, right, is if you are asking another agency to come out and do the work is revenge, right? That's something that there's a real concern about. It's like, well, this, where we're located here in this area, they can't perform the service. We're trying to get somebody else to come in to perform the service. If we do get them, then this other facility is going to come and, you know, get back at us. What are your thoughts on that, Kia? Is that true? Does that happen?
I mean, I personally, I've done this. We're in a family business. I've done this my whole life, and I can say we've never done that. I take it to heart if something goes wrong, but that's speaking for our particular agency. I know I've heard of certain things. Before I heard those, I couldn't even fathom or think of how you could do retaliation because it's just not in my blood. But I will say that back to that monitoring piece, that's a big reason why I like to say how heavy our monitoring is. It is hard for certain things to slip by, especially when it comes to grading. So if they find that our grades are off when they're monitoring those samples, they call us and we go through it. We have to send in training records. We have to do a whole slew of things, and it's all documented. Now, from what I've gathered is maybe they could push the limit on when they come out or make life a little more difficult. And that comes to a customer service thing. And my motto through this is if you are in those maybe few agencies areas that are not like the rest, don't be quiet about it. Do not be afraid to talk to FGIS. And the louder you are about it, the quicker they're going to do something about it. And so I wouldn't be afraid of that in the sense that if you don't say anything, nothing can be done because FGIS won't know about it. They do come through for compliance reviews, and they will call a good chunk of that agency's customers and ask them very honestly, what do you think of their service? And I invite you, tell the honest truth, let them know. FGIS is working really hard on, after receiving some of that feedback, on how to make it, so if we do one of those service agreements, it's just like any of us, you know, someone's kind of in on your business. And you're like, no, I want to show that I can do it. But they're working on making sure that that procedure and the culture around that is more of a, hey, we all need help every once in a while. It's not going to go against your record if you have a service agreement because you couldn't do these 2 trains. So FGIS is actively working on making sure that that's a more of an inviting process so that day to day, none of us are interrupted.
And I will say too, for those of you that are members of the National Grant Feed Association, if you do have any issues, please call me. I'd be happy to help with that and help facilitate discussions with FGIS too, as you said, and he can kind of point you in the right direction. Because I do get calls about that sometimes, stating about service being provided and not being provided, and what are the best ways to address that. And that's obviously one of the reasons we want to have this discussion here, you know, from the designated agency, because the way the process works is FGIS it's an open process. They'll put a notice out in the Federal Register stating, hey, we're looking for an official inspection agency to serve this area. You have to formally submit your application. Then once you submit your application, they choose you, and then they monitor you, right? And so they give you grades as well, and that's something that they've been working on. We've been working on from the industry standpoint for them to really kind of, I would say, update that process as far as the monitoring goes.
And what Jess talked about too is, so you can sign up for notices from the Federal Register, and they put, when our designations are up, so our designations go up every 5 years. So we have to actively apply and try to get our designation back every 5 years. And I will say a lot of times it's not like other agencies are going in and applying for other territories and things like that, but it does happen if there are service issues. I've been a part of it before. And FGIS, if you are having issues, I highly recommend putting that in that formalized process during the designation period. It does only happen every 5 years, but they'll take that very seriously, and if there is another applicant during that time, it can put things in their favor to change those boundaries. Essentially, it's one of the few ways that boundaries can be changed.
So want to shift here, from a operations safety standpoint, and I think there's obviously a lot of work that's done, from a stowage exam process, right, as we were talking about with the rail cars and stowage exams. So basically, what happens if there's a failed stowage exam, right? How do you address that situation? And I'll throw it out here, since we have a lot of safety professionals out here. What are your thoughts on rolling stock fall protection?
Yeah, do you want to start or me? All right, so safety is a big thing that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. I really loved that first presentation, and fumigation, learning more about those. Stowage exams we'll start with rail. You do have the option of having a camera, so not all people are aware of that there's a certain type of camera, we have rules around it, that can be up there, and so if we're in an on-site lab, we can watch and do stowage exams from that. That does help a lot to make sure our personnel are not on top of your rail cars. There are some areas, so in our Ohio area, Indiana, et cetera, that works great, because then we never have to go on top of your rail cars, which I'm assuming most of you don't want us up there. And so that works out really nicely, but then you have areas like North Dakota, Minnesota, and we are, pretty much all of our trains we're sealing and slamming lids. So we're already up there, so it doesn't really make sense for us to not just do the stowage exam quick. It helps with efficiencies if we're already up there. But with that fall protection, there are situations where if you have rail cars and you need to probe them, where they're already loaded, there might not be fall protection available. I'd say that is far and few between nowadays. When I first started, that was a normal occurrence, but not anymore. Generally, facilities are bringing the train up and putting it under fall protection. If we're doing inline loading, we mandate fall protection, at least our agency does. We will make sure we won't go past that fall protection line, and we'll wait for the rail cars to move under it before doing anything else. So that's really important for us for the rail cars. We've had people fall off rail cars, as I'm sure a lot of you have as well, and it's a scary situation that I wouldn't want without fall protection. With stowage exams, you also have things like containers. We're having to be in an enclosed space. This seems like a very simple common sense thing, but the biggest thing I ask is when our employees or any official agency employees are in a container, please don't leave them in there. That does happen, and you get sidetracked and you go in, because in order to do a stowage exam, we have to have those doors closed. So one of the things that we have to do is, and why those doors have to be closed, is to see if any light is coming through in basically pinhole areas, which we wouldn't be able to see without it. And you definitely want us to catch things like that, because it can hurt your grain as it's going overseas. But I have had people be locked in containers before, and then they find out when they're about to load. So please just tell people that. I always tell our employees, don't ever go in there without saying, hey, please don't leave me. Just stay out here, and then I'll knock and let you know when I need to get out. But that is probably one of the bigger ones that safety professionals have a problem with our regulations. I've been yelled at a few times of saying, there's no way that I'm gonna let one of your employees be locked into our container. Are you kidding me? But we have to do that. You cannot get a stowage exam unless we are shut in there for a minute, 30 seconds, whatever it takes. So just making sure there's safe procedures around that. On the side of stowage exams too, you asked, with failing, there is a little bit of, there's a stowage exam directive, and that is a piece of regulations, if you will, that I recommend all facility handlers read through. Anyone that's dealing with your day-to-day operations with loading trains or containers, it has a lot of really good information in there on how you can and cannot fix something. So if we fail something, I promise we're not trying to be mean or we're not just having a bad day. We're doing that to make sure. With foreign complaints, it's probably one of the biggest things they look at is, was a stowage exam done? And we have to give records and prove that we did that and did it properly. But there are very specific ways that you can fix those items. It usually has to be of like material. And I will say I'm not the one that goes out and does stowage exams, so some of you probably know better ways than I do on how to fix it. But if there are ever questions about it, it is hard to train our employees on all the different types of ways you can fix it and not fix it. So if someone's like, oh, you can't do that, and you're like, I swear I can, just call the agency manager and ask them. That can happen. There's so many different variables to it, but it's important that it's done right.
I'll just add, as you know, when I was a facility manager, I didn't want a lot of people up on top of the rail cars. So when they started talking about, hey, you know, using cameras, I know some of our facilities were some of the first facilities that got to try it out. And quite honestly, I thought, you know, this isn't going to work. And once we found some cameras and FIGUS then okayed these cameras, you know, we started putting them in because when we're loading unit trains, there's not too many people that have loading facilities that have fall protection that can stretch over 120 cars. You know, so you were talking about, you know, the official grading agency or FIGUS having to get up and down every 6 cars to do the exam, and it cost a lot of time. I'll even say right now, these cameras all in, putting in about $8,000. They're not high-end camera, or, you know, it's not something that's gonna break your bank. And it actually sped up our loading. It is a huge safety thing because you have less people on top of the rail cars, which is always a good thing. And so I think it's really an investment that's worth looking at. You know, if you do load a lot of rail cars, so you have to have stowage exams. If you haven't done it, it's pretty easy. We actually put a lot of ours on swing hooks, so we can undo a clasp, swing them right in, clean the lens every once in a while if you have to. A lot of little tricks, and you know, all you'd have to do is talk to some of the other facilities that have installed them. You know, so you learn from their mistakes, so you don't have to make the same ones, but really worthwhile putting in at your facility.
Anything from the audience? Any questions, comments on this?
In regard to the stowage exams, is that not considered a confined space entry? Like when you send someone down inside, do you not have a whole watch, or how do you eliminate that risk of somebody actually getting left inside?
Yeah, that's where, I mean, our procedure is there has to be someone there with them at all times. The situation where I've had is that that person was told that, and then they got a little sidetracked and walked away, so kind of against procedure. I will say it does not happen often at all. But yeah, they have to have someone outside at all times.
Okay, great, thanks. So as far as like the equipment, right, you have to come out to a facility every 6 months to inspect the equipment. Is there a particular reason why you have to come out every 6 months?
Yeah, we call it check testing, at least most agencies do, but it's really checking the equipment, and every piece of equipment has its own regulations on how often it has to be done, but a good rule of thumb is it's about every 6 months. Like corn, if you do corn dockage only, you can do it once a year, but generally it's that amount. So if you have an on-site lab, we come out and we do like facilities environmental check, I guess, the lab and overall making sure the lighting is good. We have a very specific parameters on the lighting. So we have light meters that we sit on there and have to document for each lab. We have to make sure our countertops are a specific color, the floors are a specific sheen, the walls are grayish colored. There's a lot of things that go into it. But with the equipment, we have reference samples that FGIS will send us, and we get reference samples for things like dockage machines, moisture meters, sieves, perlers, if any of you have those, and they have known values that we don't know. And so we go through, we run in a certain, under certain parameters, and then we enter those results into an online system, and that system will say if that piece of equipment failed or passed. If it failed, it's immediately out of the system, and we have to, we're trained on how to fix them and how to, I guess, just tinker with them a little bit to get them to work so they're within line. Sometimes it results in things needing to be repaired. Generally, that's on the facility, but we'll ask you guys and tell you what needs to be done. And that is to make sure that all of the machines are in proper working order. Those machines, a dockage machine, things can loosen up and it's going to give you a different result. Moisture meters look like one of the simplest tests to run, but I would say they are the quickest to fail if you're not on top of it with cleaning. And I say that more from on your guys' end for if you're doing your own inbound and things like that. I highly recommend getting your moisture meters. Either ask an official agency if they can't run some of their samples through to check it for you, or bring it into a place to get just regular routine maintenance done on it. Cleaning those moisture meters is a really big deal. And so yeah, we just make sure everything's in order. We also have to, if you don't have an on-site lab and you use a DT system, we have to go up and check that and make sure that the grain flow is proper, and we have a go, no-go gauge and make sure nothing is out of whack with that.
I was going to say, how often do you check your equipment?
Well, we do, as far as for our moisture meters, that kind of thing, we usually set up a company that will come in and do regular checks, and then we do a lot of cross checks between, because most of our facilities will have several moisture meters on site. And then whenever we're loading a train, unit train, we'll usually have our controller or whoever, doing the blending. We have a lab upstairs or right next to our Figus lab. And so before we start, we usually do some samples and we test them, and then we have Figus or the official grading agency run the same tests on them. And we want to make sure that we're jiving, we're getting the same numbers. So that's one of those best practices. I just always think it's important to do. We have found before where we knew we had cross-checked through our facility, of 3 or 4 different meters, and they were all on par, and all of a sudden when we went to check with the agencies, that was the one that was off, and that was actually the one that was off. And it was a good thing that we caught it, because it was off to a degree that would have been bad for us. So doing those cross checks, before every train is always very important to do.
Another reminder too, if you don't know already, is that every 6 months the moisture meters have calibrations that are made public, and I really recommend having that in your calendars or whatnot. It's August 1st and May 1st every year, and they will come out with new calibrations, and that'll keep you in line with the FGIS standards as well.
So, Don, what do you do then from the standpoint as far as lab testing? A certain type of test, I should say. What FGIS may not be able to do it, or the official agency may not be able to do it. How does that work as far as the testing goes?
Well, sometimes we buy our own equipment, which isn't cheap. I can tell you that. I don't know if any priced out a falling numbers machine, but plan on some major capital dollars. Yeah. But it matters that sometimes we have contracts that will call for certain testing that is just not done, and we have to send it to a lab halfway across the country. Now, normally when we're doing that, especially because it's not something that we've been able to test for, we will find 2 separate labs that can do the same testing, and we'll send it out to both labs. Because when we're having to have something tested and we haven't had the ability to test it, we don't want to just rely on one lab to do it. So we're going to get multiple labs to run that same test for us. But I'll say today, most of the agencies are able to do most of the testing that's required in our contracts, the aflatoxin, the vomitoxin, protein, falling numbers. We really haven't had too many problems with that, and those are probably some of the main testing that needs to be done. Going back to where we started with this talk today about that proper communication, so I think that's really important when you do have a train and you're talking to the agency and saying, hey, we have 80 cars tomorrow, 85 cars that we're going to be loading. Always make sure you're following up with them on the different testing that has to be done. If it calls for aflatoxin or vomitoxin, 5-car sublots or 10-car sublots, because that's going to dictate many times they need an extra person on site to run those tests, or if you want to get those tests in a timely manner. So again, it's really important when you're lining up the help to make sure that you're letting them know exactly what all the contract specs are and what those special maybe testing that has to be run during the train, because they have to have the right amount of people there to be able to run those tests.
Something else with the knowing tests ahead of time is when we sample and grade your guys' grain, we have a file sample that we keep. And when we have that file sample, it's not your grain, it's not our grain, it's owned by FGIS for a certain amount of days. And the reason for that is really for the different things I talked about of you guys having your own rights within the system. So we have to keep, so for rail cars, it's 10 days. For containers, it's 60 days. And each carrier is different. And the reason for that is then you can call, that sample is there, so you can call for an appeal. Not just the person requesting the service can ask for an appeal. Anyone that is essentially an interested party can ask for an appeal. So they're doing that to safeguard that sample in case someone knew something was bad and they wanted to just take that sample back so there was no evidence or whatever. It also gives people time for if there was issues. A lot of times the file retention days are based on how long it takes for that grain in that type of carrier to get to a destination. So if there's any discrepancies on the other end, I will say with containers that 60 days doesn't really cut it anymore, but if you need those samples to be, or want those samples to be kept longer by an official agency, you can definitely ask them to do that. And with the tests, if we have, say you have a train and you forgot to ask about aflatoxin and fumonisin or something. If you ask for it after the fact, we usually can handle getting out of those grams one test, but if it gets to be much more than that, it gets really difficult because we have to keep a certain amount of grams and we cannot go below that amount. And we might not have enough sample to run that test. And it's, under some circumstances, FGIS will give us a waiver, but we have to talk to the field office. They have to talk to you. It's a whole process. And it is not guaranteed that they're going to give you that waiver, especially if it's due to a mistake. And so just being really careful about that and communicating as much as possible. And then with tests that are not under the Grain Standards Act or AMA, there are a lot of agencies that do I'll call it unofficial testing, things that aren't under those acts. And go ahead and ask your agency. They might provide it. It might not even be on their fee schedule. Some of us have kind of separate entities that can do certain types of testing. But we've seen where, and to be completely honest, we'll have people call in and our receptionist will be like, oh no, we don't do that test, because we don't at the time. But if you really have a test that would benefit you for that agency to perform, talk to one of the managers and ask them. And some good things that I look at when someone's asking me about performing a new type of test is, what's the type of volume, how often is it going to be, because a lot of these kits have tight expiration dates. So if we're asking questions like that, it's generally to make sure that we're not going to lose an arm and a leg, and because we've had a lot of times people will just need it for 5 cars and then they'll never touch that test again. So just making sure, typical business practices, but a lot of agencies are very happy to do that and to add certain types on. And there's a few of us agencies that have other types of labs that are even a little bit separate companies. Like we do, we have a lab that has an HPLC machine, LCMS, GCMS, you name it, very chemical and chemistry related tests. So don't be afraid to ask what you need in that.
Well, I was just going to say, is there anything that we didn't cover? Is there anything else that you wanted to, as far as, I guess you could say, any final comments, anything else that you wanted to add to the discussion?
No, I'll just go back and say, whether it's official grading agency, FIGUS, or the facilities, again, we're all working for the same purpose, and it's to get that train loaded to, make sure that we are giving the end user accurate grades for what we say that we are loading. And it's that communication, it's that talking, making sure that everybody's on the same page. It can become a team approach. I can say over the last 15 years of my career when I was running facilities, I had great working relationships with the official agencies and with FIGUS. And when you have a good working relationship with them, it just, you can do your job better. I mean, they're speaking up quicker. They're giving you a heads up when they start to see something that they knows maybe going a little bit south. They'll give you that heads up, and it just it enables you to be more profitable. And that's what we're trying to do when we're loading. So
I'll piggyback off the communication piece. We had a good discussion last week between official agencies and industry, and off of that communication, some different examples that we come up with, and a lot of it was done. The more we know about what's going on, we don't need to know the inner workings of your business if you don't want us to know certain things, but the more we do know, the more we can help. The regulations and the directives and handbooks that we go through, I'll say I've been doing this since I was a baby, basically, and I read these handbooks on a daily basis, and I could not, if you asked me a question about something specifically, I might have to go look it up. I mean, there's thousands of pages that we have to abide by. So if you feel like an agency is saying something that either doesn't make sense to you, which some things don't make perfect common sense all the time, or you feel like maybe it's off, don't be afraid to ask why. And it's good for educational purposes too. I feel like the more you all know about what we do and the more we know about what you guys do, the more we can help each other, because we have kind of our basic sets of services that we do. And every once in a while, something will just be a little bit different, especially when you're dealing with exports. And if we don't know about the different changes or how it's working, we might not be able to think of different areas. So don't be afraid to ask, well, where does it say that? I know I've had people be like, well, I feel bad. I'm not trying to question you. And I'm like, well, question away. I want to help you, and maybe I didn't think of something. So it's fun for me to be able to send screenshots and links to where it is, and you can learn more for your business as well. And then I do also recommend with those handbooks, agencies can give you certain ones that apply more to your facilities. In a lot of these handbooks and directives, some people don't realize there's sections in it that say applicant's responsibility. So you guys too have responsibilities within these handbooks and directives that we're not necessarily obligated to watch out for or monitor ourselves. So if that's something you're interested in, you can reach out to me, but don't be afraid to reach out to your other agencies you work with and ask what things they think would be most applicable to you.
Well, and also I will say too, for the trade association, the American Association of Grain Inspection and Weighing Agencies, that obviously you're serving as
Yep.
you're vice president, you're an officer within that organization. And NGFA has a very good relationship with AGWA, and so obviously that's how we work together and share information, because a lot of the current officially designated agencies, a majority of them are members of your organization too. So by having that opportunity and using our trade groups to communicate and share information, that's very helpful too, and how we can work. We worked on developing, that's why I brought up the rolling stock issue, because we had worked on developing that document together too, on sharing that information, what the policies are. But obviously we wanted to have this discussion talking about this. Obviously we're anticipating with harvest coming up and talking about transportation and some other traits that are out there. Obviously, as both Kia and Don are saying, communication between the facility and the official agencies is going to be very important. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. All right. Well, before we head to lunch in the trade show area, I wanted to let everyone know that we will have 3 afternoon presentations. At 1:30, we'll hear about managing a safety and health incident, addressing effective techniques to identify, prevent, respond to, record, and analyze exposure to health and safety risks in the workplace. At 2:30, the topic will be how to perform a safety and health incident investigation and analyze hazards, which will provide recommendations on how to use safety and health incident investigations to determine the root cause and establish corrective actions. And at 4 p.m., our final presentation will cover airflow, lessons learned and practical applications of air facilities. A buffet lunch will be served in the trade show area. Please visit the exhibitors, and we'll see you back here at 1:30 p.m. Thank you.